Hey, today I'm starting a 20 episode series called Psychological Exit Ramps, where people quietly reclaim their thinking. This is episode 1. There's a moment in life that almost everyone experiences. Something feels slightly off. Nothing dramatic is happening. No one is yelling. No obvious conflict. No clear threat. But something inside you starts to register that the situation you're in doesn't quite make sense. Maybe it's a conversation, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a group you belong to, or maybe it's an environment where certain things feel strangely difficult to question. You can't quite explain what's wrong, but you begin to notice something. Your behavior is being shaped in ways you didn't consciously choose. Your reactions are being steered. Your thinking is being nudged. And the strange part is, it rarely feels like control in the traditional sense. There are no chains, no direct commands, no obvious authority forcing compliance. Instead, the pressure appears through social expectations, emotional leverage, or carefully framed narratives about what a good person should do. And most people go their entire lives inside systems like this without ever noticing. And it's not because they're weak, but because the mechanisms involved are psychological, invisible, and incredibly effective. Control rarely begins with force, it begins with influence. And influence becomes powerful when it shapes how someone interprets reality. Many forms of psychological control operate through something very simple. They make certain thoughts feel permitted and others feel dangerous. Over time, a person begins to self regulate. They stop asking certain questions, they avoid certain topics, they learn what kinds of statements receive approval and which ones trigger tension or disapproval. This is where the trap begins. Because once a person begins adjusting their behavior to maintain social stability, something subtle happens inside the mind. Their thinking gradually shifts from, what do I actually see here, to, what response will maintain harmony in this environment. That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. When someone starts organizing their thoughts around avoiding conflict, protecting relationships, or maintaining belonging, they often stop examining the structure of the situation itself. They adapt. And adaptation is often rewarded. People who cooperate with the expectations of a group are seen as supportive, loyal, trustworthy. Meanwhile, people who question those expectations may be seen as disruptive, difficult, or even morally suspect. Over time, the environment begins to train everyone involved, not through threats, but through incentives, approval, belonging, safety. And because these forces are emotional rather than physical, most people don't experience them as control. They experience them as normal life. This is one reason psychological control is so effective. It operates through participation. The system doesn't need to force behavior. People learn to regulate themselves quietly, automatically, often without realizing it. And that's where the most interesting moment occurs. Because every once in a while, someone notices. The moment of realization rarely arrives as a dramatic confrontation. It usually arrives quietly. Sometimes it happens during a conversation where something small doesn't add up. You ask a simple question, not an aggressive question, not an accusation, just curiosity. And suddenly, the reaction you receive feels disproportionate. The atmosphere changes. The response isn't about answering the question, it's about shutting the question down. And you might hear phrases like, "Why would you even ask that? That's not something we need to get into. You're overthinking this. Just trust the process." At first, it feels confusing because the question itself seemed reasonable. But what you're witnessing in that moment is something extremely revealing. You're seeing the boundary of the system. Every psychological system has invisible lines that people are not supposed to cross. Certain topics are acceptable, certain conclusions are safe, but certain questions introduce instability. And when someone accidentally touches one of those questions, the system reacts, not necessarily through punishment, but through pressure, social pressure, emotional pressure, sometimes moral pressure. The goal of that pressure is simple: return the conversation back inside the acceptable boundaries. And once you notice this happening, something begins to change. You start replaying past experiences in your mind. Moments where discussion suddenly stopped, moments where someone became defensive, moments where curiosity was treated as a problem, and slowly a pattern begins to emerge. You realize that the environment you're in isn't just a neutral space where ideas can be explored, it's a structure that quietly guides how people think, what they say, what they avoid saying, and what they are allowed to see. This realization can feel disorienting at first because it challenges a basic assumption most people carry, that their thinking is completely their own. But when you begin noticing how incentives, expectations, and emotional pressure shape behavior, something surprising becomes visible. Much of what we call normal behavior is actually adaptive behavior. People adjusting themselves to the invisible rules of their environment. Not because they want to deceive anyone, but because belonging is powerful, approval is powerful, and conflict can feel threatening. Once this pattern becomes visible, a new question naturally arises. If people are constantly adjusting themselves to maintain stability inside the system, then how often are their actions truly their own? And that question leads to one of the most important realizations a person can have. Control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like agreement. Agreement that has quietly been shaped by forces no one stopped to examine. When someone reaches this point of clarity, something subtle but important happens inside their mind. They begin to separate two things that previously felt identical: participation and understanding. They realize that they may have been participating in a system without fully understanding how that system was shaping them. And once that distinction appears, something new becomes possible. Not rebellion, not conflict, something much simpler: awareness, the beginning of an exit ramp. Once someone notices the pattern, the first instinct is often to fight it, to argue, to expose the system, to prove to everyone that something manipulative is happening. But that reaction usually pulls a person deeper into the system itself because psychological control often survives through conflict just as easily as it survives through agreement. The real exit ramp is much quieter. It begins with a simple shift in attention. Instead of trying to immediately change the situation, a person begins to observe it more carefully. They start asking different questions internally. Not who is controlling me, but what pressures are shaping behavior in this moment? What incentives are people responding to? What kinds of statements are welcomed? Which ones create tension? Once you begin looking at the system this way, it stops feeling mysterious. Patterns start to reveal themselves. You notice who gets rewarded, who gets ignored. You notice what kinds of ideas move smoothly through conversations and which ones cause discomfort. And something interesting happens when you see these dynamics clearly. The emotional pressure begins to lose some of its power because the pressure was never just about the specific situation. It was about your interpretation of it. When a person believes social approval equals truth, pressure feels overwhelming. But when they see approval as a behavioral incentive rather than a moral signal, the pressure begins to loosen. They no longer need to fight the system. They simply understand it. And understanding changes how they participate. They speak a little more carefully. They listen a little more closely. They stop assuming that the loudest reactions reflect the most accurate thinking. And most importantly, they stop confusing agreement with clarity. At this point, the system may still exist. The expectations may still be there. But something inside the observer has changed. They are no longer unconsciously adapting to the environment. They are aware of it. That awareness is the exit ramp. Not because it forces an immediate decision, but because it restores the most important capability a person has, the ability to see. Once someone begins seeing these patterns clearly, they often notice the same structures appearing in many different places: organizations, social groups, online communities, political movements, even personal relationships. The patterns appear, and once you've seen them, it's very difficult to completely unsee them again. Many of the ideas behind recognizing these kinds of patterns are explained more deeply in a book I wrote called Psychological Exit Ramps. The book examines the subtle psychological mechanisms that shape human behavior. Here it is. The book examines the subtle psychological mechanisms that shape human behavior and the quiet moments when people begin stepping outside their influences. But the most important thing to remember is that none of this requires confrontation. Clarity itself changes how you move through the world. The strange thing about psychological control is that it often dissolves the moment it becomes visible. Not because the system disappears, but because the observer has changed. Most systems rely on unconscious participation, people adjusting themselves automatically to maintain stability. But when someone begins observing those adjustments instead of simply performing them, a small space opens up, a space between stimulus and reaction. Inside that space, something simple but powerful becomes possible. Not the loud kind of choice people associate with rebellion or resistance, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from understanding what is happening, while everyone else is still reacting automatically. And for many people, the moment they realize that space exists is the moment everything begins to look different. That moment is the beginning of an exit ramp. If this idea resonates with you, the next episodes the next episodes explore for another psychological exit ramp people discover when they start seeing clearly. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is simply stepping off the road. And with that, I will see you in the next one. Have a great day and peace.